Shakespeare haunts us. He says, "Adieu, adieu, adieu, remember me. Remember thee," cries Hamlet, "I, thou poor ghost, whilst memory holds a seat in this distracted globe." The metadrama, the dramatic self-consciousness of these lines is profound. Not least if you remember the theatrical tradition that Shakespeare himself acted the part of the ghost of Hamlet's father. "Remember thee," cries Hamlet, "yea, from the table of my memory I'll wipe away all trivial fond records, all sores of books, all forms, all precious past that youth and observation copied there. And thy commandment all alone shall live within the book and volume of my brain, unmixed with baser matter." Why do we remember? Because we must. Why do we remember Shakespeare? Because his ghost tells us to. But what does it mean to remember Shakespeare? And what in the process do we forget? These are my questions for this evening. To answer them, I want to think about 1616, the year of Shakespeare's death, and about 1916, the tercentenary of his death, the first of the Shakespeare centenaries to be consciously marked across the world, and also about 2016, the quarter centenary. What have I done there? What was that? That wasn't supposed to go there. Hang on. What I wish to address is what it means to remember Shakespeare. What in the process of remembering we forget, and thus to reflect on the ethics of the remembering and of the forgetting. I do so in a particular context, the context of the early modern moment in which remembering and the idea of the nation were deeply interwoven. Social memory was a concept both appropriated and shaped by the emergent nation state at this time. And in Shakespeare's London, it was generated in very particular ways by the theatres, which both inculcated and critiqued the dominant ideology. So the story I'll tell is about Shakespeare, about theatre, about nation, and about the ethics of remembering and forgetting. Now this year I've been involved, as you've heard, in the celebrations in the United Kingdom for the Shakespeare quarter centenary through creating and directing Shakespeare 400. It's a bit fuzzy, I'm afraid, but Shakespeare 400. The consortium that was led by my university, King's College London, that brought together 30 or so of London's leading cultural and creative organisations to mark the occasion. I learned a lot in the process about creating a cultural festival. Thus, my admiration for what the organisers of this excellent festival achieve is that much more heartfelt than it would have been previously. And I've learned that it's a lot easier working with key national cultural organisations than it is with certain internal elements of my own university. I've also learned what national remembering means in practice, who will want to be involved, why they want to be involved, who remembers, who forgets, what they forget. Some organisations I would in truth go out of my way to avoid being involved with ever again. But far more of them turned out to be a joy to work with, I'm happy to say. Intellectually, what I've learned most about, I think, is the ethics of commemorative practice, the selectivity involved in the process. And it's that, what we remember, what we don't, that I wish to address this evening, in part by looking back 100 years to the original inspiration for our Shakespeare 400 project this year. That is to an academic called Sir Israel Gollancz, a predecessor of mine as Professor of English at King's College London, who, at least as much as Shakespeare himself, is the key personality, the hero, if you like, of this talk. I've learnt to believe that he was a thoroughly nice man who I would have liked to have had a drink with, but I can't do that because he's gone. But I'll begin at the beginning, in 1616, the year of Shakespeare's death. The year 1616 began in London with a performance at court on the 1st of January of a masque called The Golden Age Restored by Shakespeare's complicated friend, the poet and playwright Ben Jonson. On the 10th of January, the diplomat Sir Thomas Roe presented King James I's compliments to the Mughal Emperor Jahangir Khan, thus opening a relationship that he could not have imagined would lead eventually to British colonial rule of India. In February, Galileo was banned by the Vatican from defending Copernicus's claim that the planets revolve around the sun. And in a different scientific revolution, William Harvey presented his views on the circulation of the blood at the College of Physicians in London. 2 weeks later, the adventurer Sir Walter Raleigh was released from the Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned for treason, to go off in search of El Dorado. He didn't find it. In October, a Dutch ship, the Eendracht, made the second recorded landfall by Europeans on Australian soil. In November, René Descartes graduated from the University of Poitiers, and Ben Jonson published his collected plays under the title Works, causing outrage at the idea that mere drama could be considered literature. So that's what was happening in 1616. Notable literary or theatrical deaths in 1616 include Philip Henslowe, entrepreneur of the Rose Playhouse across the road from Shakespeare's Globe, without whose account books our knowledge of the conditions of performance in Shakespeare's London would be drastically reduced. He died on the 6th of January. Francis Beaumont, a hugely talented but tragically short-lived playwright, died on the 6th of March. Tang Jianzhu, the great Chinese poet and playwright, died on the 20th of July. Richard Hakluyt, geographer, collector of travel narratives, and early English enthusiast for the colonization of America, died on the 23rd of November. And of course, the 23rd of April, Shakespeare's death day, was the date of another significant death, that of a highly influential author and national icon whose writings in Spanish have inspired readers since his day and who has been translated into many languages, by which, of course, I could mean Miguel de Cervantes, Spain's equivalent for Shakespeare for global recognition, but also, as you may know, Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, first chronicler of the history of Latin America and the first writer born in the Americas to be published in Europe, whose Comentarios Reales de los Incas, first published in 1609, was later banned from being sold in South America because its contents provided historical grounds for resistance to Spanish colonial rule. Now I have to tell you the truth, which is that I frankly didn't know a thing about Garcilaso de la Vega until I was talking about the coincidence of the death days of Shakespeare and Cervantes with Chantal Signorio, the organizer of this wonderful festival. And she said, and don't forget Inca Garcilaso de la Vega. To which I replied in my deeply intellectual way, who? If I needed reminding how spatially and culturally limited remembering is, this was a valuable prompt. A major early modern writer, a key witness to the early history of Chile and Peru, and I didn't know anything about him. Shame on me. And it brought to mind an occasion in spring 2002, the annual gathering of the Shakespeare Association of America. America, as you would guess in this case, means the United States and Canada. A speaker was addressing what to her was clearly the key cultural and political question of the year. What difference does 9/11 make to Shakespeare studies? A question which produced a somewhat skeptical reaction from the Europeans present. And yes, Brexit notwithstanding, the British are European. But this question seemed to enthrall our colleagues from the United States. At the end of the talk, there were questions. And one person put a hand up and said, "I am Chilean. For me and my friends and family, 9/11 had significance for 3 decades before the event you're referring to, because the 11th of September 1973 was the date," this was her phrasing, "the date of the CIA-sponsored coup by the dictator Pinochet against the lawful government of Allende. So don't assume you have a monopoly on 9/11s. You can imagine the silence, can't you? To me, this says something very simple. Whenever we remember an event or a person, we are forgetting events and people. It's impossible not to. What we remember depends on who we are, when we are, where we are. We, in 2016, are going to remember Shakespeare and Cervantes. And we may perhaps, if we enjoy the theatre of Shakespeare's day, remember Beaumont and Henslowe and the publication of the Johnson First Folio. But not all of us, at least not me, are going to remember Tang Jianzhu or Garcilaso de la Vega, because we're not geographically or culturally attuned to what they achieved. Because history can function like geography, the cliché that the past is a foreign country. In 1616, nobody made much fuss about the death of a 50-something retired poet, playwright, and Stratford landowner. It seems extraordinary to us now that Shakespeare's death wasn't acknowledged in 1616 in some tangible way. But it wasn't. His epitaph had to wait 7 years until 1623 and the publication of the First Folio, his posthumously assembled collected works. 3 centuries later, the aging Thomas Hardy, famous English poet, contributed the opening poem to a curious collection, one that I will return to, called A Book of Homage to Shakespeare, edited by Israel Gallantz, the professor at King's College London with the bushy moustache. In it, Hardy expresses puzzlement at Shakespeare's inscrutability, bright, baffling soul, least capturable of themes. Thou who displayedst a life of commonplace, leaving no intimate word or personal trace of high design outside the artistry of thy penned dreams, still shalt remain at heart unread eternally. You can sense a poet kind of struggling for subject matter here, can't you? Hardy then imagines a visitor to Stratford asking about Shakespeare and getting what you might think of as a not wholly engaged reply. This is 4 lines down with, "Yes, a worthy man and well-to-do, though as for me, I knew him but by just a neighbour's nod, 'tis true. I' faith few knew him much here, save by word, he having elsewhere led his busier life. Though to be sure he left with us his wife. I, one of the tradesman's sons, I now recall witty, I've heard. We did not know. Well, good day, death comes to all." So much for local memory. He having elsewhere led his busier life. But what of London? Was Shakespeare alive and well on the stage in 1616? What was his company performing when he died? Well, we don't know for sure, not as regards the public stage anyway, because we have no records of the public stage from that time. But the official records of performances at court tell us that all but 2 of the plays in the 1604-5 Christmas season are by Shakespeare. Othello and Measure for Measure. You can see that. I haven't got a pointer, but you can see that. The second line, it says Measure for Measure, spelled oddly. Both plays that were new at the time. And revivals of The Comedy of Errors, Merchant of Venice, Henry V, The Merry Wives of Windsor, and Love's Labour's Lost. By the 1611-12 season, playwrights other than Shakespeare have a noticeably larger share. There are 2 Shakespeare plays, the first recorded performance of The Tempest, alongside The Winter's Tale, plus a selection by Beaumont and Fletcher and others. The following year includes a mixed bag of revivals: Julius Caesar, Much Ado About Nothing, Othello again, and more recent plays, The Winter's Tale and The Tempest again, plus some new plays, including the lost Shakespeare-Fletcher collaboration, Cardenio, apparently to judge by its title, based on Cervantes. By the next season, for which we have reasonably complete records, 1621 to 2, 6 plays are listed, of which 4 are by Fletcher and none by Shakespeare. It's what you'd expect, really, a gradual shift away from the work of the former dominant playwright of the King's Company to the man who was his successor at that company, with diminishing revivals of Shakespeare's most popular play from what you might call the company backlist. Yet this doesn't tell the whole story. One play first published in 1616 was Fletcher's comedy The Scornful Lady, which would in due course become a staple of the Restoration stage after 1660, when the theatres reopened. More popular in that decade and the following decade than any of Shakespeare's plays. Yet the plot of The Scornful Lady resembles that of Much Ado About Nothing, and it reflects the playwright Fletcher's ongoing engagement with the work of Shakespeare, with, for example, Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, in the play The Tamer Tamed, in which the character Petruchio remarries after Kate has died, but gets firmly put in his place by his new wife, who has absolutely no intention of being tamed, thank you very much. So what you're seeing is a kind of competitive dependence and a kind of remembrance. Moreover, Fletcher, Shakespeare's successor, was very dependent on another of our 1616 writers, who you may recognize, Cervantes. As I've said, it looks from the title of the lost play Cardenio that Shakespeare and Fletcher had found their source in Cervantes. And in total, Fletcher used Cervantes as his source in no fewer than 15 plays. So an apparently new repertory can reveal a dynamics of dependence on what has gone before, dependence that becomes de facto memorial over time. We need, in other words, to be aware that the new plays displacing Shakespeare from the stage in 1616 and beyond were also in a certain way themselves responding to the ghost's injunction, remember me. Remembering, like grieving, is an uneven process, and as often as not, more is forgotten than is remembered. In 1716 and 1816, there were no centenary or bicentenary celebrations of Shakespeare. Garrick's Jubilee, a bardolatrous extravaganza planned to mark the bicentenary of Shakespeare's birth in 1764, though it didn't actually take place until 1769, was the first event to celebrate a Shakespearean centenary with the kind of reverence that we would now expect. And it began the process that led to Stratford-upon-Avon becoming the epicenter of Shakespearean tourism. Plans for the 1916 tercentenary were in process from the beginning of the 20th century, but the outbreak of the First World War meant wholesale changes. 2 outcroppings of the urge to remember Shakespeare in 1916 are, I think, worth reflecting on. One is a book, and the other is a building. I'll start with the book, which I've already mentioned, and which includes an element that will be of particular interest, I hope, to you. On the 23rd of April 1916, Oxford University Press published a book of homage to Shakespeare, edited by Professor Israel Golantz. Within its elegant pages, following the poem by Thomas Hardy that we've already looked at, are 105 essays and 61 poems. You get a sense of the contents page there. From locations as far apart as India, Armenia, Burma, Russia, and Japan. A book of homage to Shakespeare is thus a celebration both local and global. And it marks, I would argue, a pivotal moment in literary history, a moment at which Shakespeare was the poet both of empire, the British Empire, and of a world emerging into a new, very different post-colonial order. A global war, a global Shakespeare. It's this unforeseen, unwelcome, yet oddly productive convergence that makes the Book of Homage so fascinating. It expresses the time and place, the many places, of the First World War, both in what it includes and what it excludes. Surprise, surprise, there are no entries from Germany, Austria-Hungary, or Turkey. It expresses, too, the time and place of Shakespeare in global culture 300 years after the playwright's death, offering a vision of the Shakespearean future that is intriguingly complex. The Book of Homage has sort of traditionally been dismissed by commentators as just late imperial British propaganda. I want to suggest, by contrast, that through the resilience and flexibility of its editor, Israel Golantz, it gives us access to a vision of the world in 1916 that can only be seen from the unique place that Shakespeare held and continues to hold in global culture. It offers both a celebration of Shakespeare the national poet and a demonstration of the vast geographical reach of what we might call the Shakespeare effect. Reading it 100 years on, we can see clearly the extent to which academic and public engagement with Shakespeare has changed since 1916. Yet also the extent to which the same basic questions and problems nag at us still, by no means resolved. It's far more complex than might be expected, balancing imperial celebration with elements both of resistance to Shakespeare as a figurehead for empire, and of self-fashioning on the part of its contributors. And I want to look at the way in which its editor and three of its contributors set out to remember Shakespeare in 1916. Golantz, as his name suggests, was a second-generation Englishman of Polish-Jewish origin, thoroughly cosmopolitan in outlook, and he had a vision for Shakespeare that was genuinely global. As far back as 1906, announcing a competition for the design of a statue to Shakespeare, which was never built, he had argued for a Shakespearean movement which will be truly international, an endeavor to link the world by the one common enthusiasm ever increasing for the great world poet of modern times. This is Golantz's language. He claims that, quote, "it may reasonably be expected that organizations will be formed throughout the world from China to Peru to help the carrying out of the idea of a world monument to Shakespeare." And he carries on, "Transcending all divisions of race, nationality, and speech, Shakespeare links together all peoples of the world." And these internationalist aims inform his choice as editor of contributions to the Book of Homage, projecting a global culture that goes far beyond the influence of the British Empire, in effect initiating the era of global Shakespeare. The Book of Homage thus has a complex relationship both to its cultural moment and to global politics. And three contributions in particular, as I've said, stand out, none of which is what it might initially seem. The first is a poem in Irish Gaelic by Douglas Hyde, future President of the Irish Republic, entitled "How It Fared with a Gale at Stratford-on-Avon." I'm not going to try and read the Gaelic, I'm afraid. Hyde appears, as one critic has noted, rather an odd person for Golantz to have approached in connection with the book. Hyde was founder of the Gaelic League, created for the promotion of the Irish language and Irish culture, a process that made clear, in the words of a speech he'd given in 1892, what he called the necessity of de-Anglicizing Ireland. Golantz asked him for a contribution nonetheless. And he obliged with a poem that may have surprised Golantz a little bit. Its premise is the journey of an Irishman who acknowledges right at the start that England was not liked of me. And he observes that he had sorely suffered, he and his people. Hatred was in his heart. But his distaste for England is calmed by a visit to Stratford-upon-Avon. It's only when you look closely at the parallel stanzas, the Gaelic and the English, and it's very obvious there at stanza 25, that there's a discrepancy. Most of the 4-line stanzas are matched by either 4 or at least 3 full lines of English. But stanza 25 is accompanied by a translation very noticeably briefer than any other. There are 4 lines of Gaelic, but the English is just, "O Albion, if an enemy knock at thy door, take him to Stratford on the Avon." Well, this looks a bit odd, right? Can you guess why? To readers of Gaelic, it would have been very amusing indeed, since Hyde's full translation, and this is his notes that the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. now has, the full translation reads as follows: "O Albion, deceitful, sinful, guileful, hypocritical, destructive, lying, slippery. If an enemy knock at thy door, take him to Stratford on the Avon." As you would expect, there was a certain amount of correspondence between Gollancz and Hyde about this. Gollancz inquired politely if it would be acceptable to Hyde if the translation could be toned down in a few places, and Hyde graciously replied, "You have been so kind and have taken such an awful lot of trouble over the homage book that of course no one could find it in their heart to hold out against anything you desire, though we couldn't resist a little further mischief, adding, would this do you? O Albion who destroyedst my ancestors, O Albion of the smooth words." Hyde's poem is a gem, providing a little subversion in the midst of all the English patriotism. But there's a further contribution to the Book of Homage that does equally fascinating work. It's called A South African's Homage. And it stands out for a number of reasons, not least because it's the only anonymous essay in the collection. The writer was in fact Solomon Chekisho Plaiki, newspaper editor, activist, and first General Secretary of the then South African Native National Congress, which became the African National Congress. He was a major figure in the history of South African liberation. That he is not named is not so surprising, given his identity and politics. I don't know exactly how Gollancz met him, but he was in London from 1914 to 1917 as part of a delegation of SANNC activists seeking the repeal of the 1913 Land Act, a law that drastically curtailed the rights of black Africans to own or occupy land. Plaiki was a highly productive writer, translating 4 of Shakespeare's plays into Setswana and publishing the first novel in English by a black African, and his contribution to the Book of Homage is fascinating. He begins by noting that, having gone to see Hamlet at a theatre in Kimberley, he became, quote, curious to know more about Shakespeare and his works, and he found social value in so doing. Intelligence in Africa, he writes, is carried from mouth to mouth by means of conversations after working hours. And reading a number of Shakespeare's works, I always had a fresh story to tell. I first read The Merchant of Venice, he notes, and then he adds, mischievously, the characters were so realistic that I was asked more than once to which of certain speculators then operating around Kimberley Shakespeare referred as Shylock. Tongue is already firmly in cheek then, and Plaiki's politics are becoming clear. He proceeds to develop a personal, political, and linguistic story by way of Shakespeare. He explains that when he met his future wife, marrying as they were across tribal and linguistic boundaries, it may be depended upon, he says, that we both read Romeo and Juliet. My people, he continues, resented the idea of my marrying a girl who spoke a language which had clicks in it, while her people abominated the idea of giving their daughter in marriage to a fellow who spoke with a language so imperfect as to be without any clicks. But the civilized laws of Cape Colony saved us from a double tragedy in a cemetery. Now, this last sentence offers a perspective, social and political, that implies the reader's complicity in the humor with which the politics of colonial rule is underlined. Plaiki then goes on to note that in 1910, when Halley's Comet made an appearance, 3 rulers died around the same time: King Edward VII of Great Britain and 2 great Bechuana chiefs, using Pleiky's terms here, sebele and bathoeng, and he reports that in writing newspaper obituaries for all three, he'd included the same Shakespeare quotation at the head of each. When beggars die, there are no comets seen, the heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes. So he's thus neatly aligning the British king and the two South African chiefs as equals. And he does similar work in his final section, praising Shakespeare for what he calls his keen grasp of human character and addressing the emergence of African literature. It is to be hoped that with the maturity of African literature, now still in its infancy, writers and translators will consider the matter of giving to Africans the benefit of some, at least, of Shakespeare's works. That this could be done is suggested by the probability that some of the stories on which his dramas are based find equivalents in African folklore. So Pleiky enacts a cultural performance by way of a life story set out as a journey into appreciation of Shakespeare. It's tempting to read this as symptomatic of what post-colonial theory would call a subaltern subject position, the educated native finding his self-construction by way of a symbol of colonial power. But the word equivalent is key here. Shakespeare is placed alongside, not above, African literature. Pleiky renegotiates Shakespearean authority in relation to the language of Black South Africa, and he finds a form of post-colonial self-fashioning through the very key figurehead of colonial rule, Shakespeare. So Pleiky, just like the Irish writer Hyde, deploys a mixture of resistance and playfulness to fashion a new identity through, not in spite of, Shakespeare. You'll probably have been wondering something by now. Is there, amongst the various contributions to the Book of Homage, one from Latin America? And the answer, I'm happy to say, is yes. There is one such contribution. And what's more, it's by a Chilean, Carlos Silva Vildosula, a former director of El Mercurio in Santiago, who at the time of the Book of Homage was acting as the newspaper's war correspondent in Europe. You probably know more about him than I do. But I've enjoyed the prompt to look more closely at his essay in the Book of Homage, which is called Shakespeare y las literaturas hispanoaméricas. He has rather a grandiose prose style, but it's worth persevering. He begins, as he means to go on, placing Shakespeare alongside Cervantes and sustaining a direct comparison between them.
Ambas hallaron en Shakespeare y en Cervantes los hombres que debían fijar para siempre su lengua como instrumento del arte literario, los que debían crearles una literatura como producto de su historia, encarnación de su carácter nacional y guía eterno de su inspiración.
And he adds,
profundamente diversos en sus concepciones, como es diversa el alma inglesa de la española, los dos genios se asemejan en que ambos no solo representan a sus razas respectivas en sus obras, sino aún en su carácter individual y en sus vidas.
He also contrasts the two writers in ways designed to make them typical of their nationalities. Shakespeare, he claims,
es una combinación equilibrada de idealista y de hombre práctico, de poeta soñador y de negociante afortunado.
While Cervantes
es un soldado aventurero, caballeresco e intrépido, que aspira en sus horas de tristeza a emigrar a América, refugio de los desesperados de España, que escribe en una prisión gran parte de su obra inmortal.
Sensible English Shakespeare is less fun than swashbuckling Spanish Cervantes, clearly. Yet despite the immense historical influence of these contrasting personalities, he notes, next one.
Ni Shakespeare ni Cervantes encuentran ni tienen en sus patrias monumentos dignos de su gloria. La modesta estatua de Leicester Square es digna hermana de la triste figura de la Plaza de las Coretes de Madrid.
Possibly not an especially welcome observation for his editor Gollancz, whose committee had failed in their intention to build a statue of Shakespeare in London. The self-consciousness with which Carlos Silva Vildosula outlines the national characteristics of Shakespeare and Cervantes has a reason, one that becomes clearer after a while, when he notes the effect of centuries of colonial history.
Más de 20 naciones hablan hoy la lengua de Shakespeare, o la de Cervantes en América, Asia, África y Oceanía, fuera de un número incontable de islas sembradas en todos los mares y que son centros de cultura británica o española.
And then he offers an unexpectedly apocalyptic vision.
Y si se imagina que un cataclismo destruye la Europa, que una convulsión pavorosa hace desaparecer estas nacionalidades que por tanto tiempo han guiado el progreso humano, todas las lenguas que en ellas se hablan serían en breve lenguas muertas, como el griego y el latín, y sus literaturas se convertirían en objetos de pacientes investigaciones para los eruditos.
I find this eschatology fascinating, not least because of the way Carlos Silva Vildósola then moves quite abruptly to the topic of Shakespeare and Latin America.
Y si
hang on, I've missed a bit out. Out there, Shakespeare enseña, I forgot about it.
Claro, eso. Shakespeare enseña a los jóvenes literaturas americanas que hoy se esfuerzan por darse un carácter propio, la lección del patriotismo y del espíritu nacional.
And he concludes his essay by bringing together these two elements, the crisis of the tired old world and the youth and character of the new.
Y si un día, en el rodar de la historia, la Europa a que debemos nuestra existencia, nuestra cultura, lo que somos y hemos sido, sufre o enloquece de dolor en el tormento de alguna de sus grandes crisis, el vínculo creado por Shakespeare y Cervantes hará que este nuevo Rey Lear vea surgir del otro lado de los mares las cordelias británicas y españolas, fieles a las razas que les dieron el ser.
Thank you. This image, Europe as the demented King Lear, the post-colonial nations as Cordelia crossing the seas to rescue him, is very striking. Not least, of course, because in the play, Cordelia arrives at the head of a foreign invading army, and neither she nor her father survives. Thank you very much, I appreciate it. This projection of the future is performed very consciously in the context of the First World War. Earlier in the year, Carlos Silva Vildósola had published a paper on Chile's approach to the First World War, in which he complained of the attitude of the European nations to Chile, not giving us the place of which we believed ourselves worthy, of confounding Chile, a nation of order, and one whose history may be examined without finding in it anything to put to the blush, with other republics that have been wont to furnish material for comic opera and light song. Any idea which of your neighbours he's talking about there? I don't know. But he chooses sides nonetheless and comes down firmly on the side of the Allies against Germany. The reason is not hard to see. It's based in profound concern about the new synthetic processes invented by German scientists for manufacturing sodium nitrate, when previously, as I don't need to tell this audience, Europe had been dependent for this key ingredient in the making of explosives on minerals mined from Atacama and elsewhere. Germany, he writes, has declared a sort of war upon our product. But underlying his arguments is the clear premise that the future lies not in Europe, but in America, whose people he describes as the humanity of the future. I think that's you, by the way. The forces, he concludes, that are still wanting in our young American peoples, we must seek in Europe. But at the same time, noting the self-inflicted devastation caused by the war, he argues that the balm that will cure the wounds of the old continent, today gaping and bleeding, can only be found here beyond the seas. So the war offers a crucial opportunity, one which Carlos Silva Vildósola outlined a year later in a full-length book on Chile and the war. In the future, he writes, nothing will be able to stop the tremendous swing of the American commerce, which is developing in all parts of the continent, while Europe is spending its strength on a work of devastation. So it seems that for Carlos Silva Vildósola, the apocalypse outlined in his essay on Shakespeare is not, after all, so fanciful. So Galance's three contributors, Hyde, Plaikey, and Silva, and Carlos Silva Vildósola, in remembering Shakespeare, are not so much remembering the past as in imagining a set of futures. These futures involve the construction of nations, a new Ireland, soon to emerge. The Easter Rising happened at pretty much exactly the same time as the Shakespeare tercentenary. A new South Africa that would require a century to arise. And in the case of Carlos Silva Vildósola, something more conservative, something more frankly based on national economic advantage. These are national visions emerging from the process of remembering. Look at how remembering has ramified here, has become something quite other than what it looked like it was going to be. And it's to manifestations of the national that I want to turn again now. Because as I've been saying, commemoration and the nation seem to be very closely tied up when it comes to Shakespeare. And I want to just briefly to consider, I will make it very brief, the second significant focus of Shakespearean commemoration in London in 1916. This is very strange. A curious building called the Shakespeare Hut. Initially, the hut, a Shakespeare hut, little building, except it isn't so little. Initially, as I've noted, the plan had been for the creation of a statue of Shakespeare to be put up in London. But increasingly it was argued that the only appropriate way to commemorate the great playwright will be to build not a statue, but a theatre. The Shakespeare Memorial National Theatre Committee was thus formed from a merger of the former Statue Committee and all the enthusiasts for the idea of a national theatre, which had begun back in 1848 with support from people like Charles Dickens and Matthew Arnold. Gollancz, he was everywhere at this point, you understand. He was the chairman of this committee. And it was a committee now not for building a statue, but for building a theatre in memory of Shakespeare. Fundraising, as always, was painfully slow. But by 1916, the committee had acquired a plot of land in central London. There was still no theatre, nor could the committee seek to raise money in the middle of the war. That would have been inelegant, right? Thus, they had to decide what to do with the plot of land for the duration of the conflict. It was Gollancz who found a solution. He brokered an arrangement with the YMCA for the creation of temporary accommodation for Commonwealth troops, mainly New Zealanders, but also Australians, on the theatre site, which was known as, the Shakespeare Hut. See, more than a hut. Temporary it may have been, but it included substantial accommodation, dining facilities, a shop, and crucially for Gollancz, a concert hall, in which Shakespearean performances took place, strictly for the soldiers, but throughout the war, and featuring some of the very finest actors of the day, who would never have performed in such a tiny little setless space otherwise. It was not exactly the theatre that Gollancz and his committee had had in mind, but it did mean that Shakespearean performances of a certain kind took place in a commemorative space on the chosen site. And there was eventually, protracted though the process was, and despite all the setbacks, a long-lasting legacy from these Shakespeare tercentenary activities. Since the work of Gollancz's committee did, though not until long after his death, culminate in the establishment of the United Kingdom's National Theatre. Not on the original site, which was eventually sold off, but first at the Old Vic in 1963, and then in 1976, at last moving, that's the Shakespeare Hut again, sorry, at last moving into its own purpose-built theatre on the South Bank. Its foundation stone, and if you ever manage to go to the National, it's at the back of the foyer, the foundation stone begins with the words, "In memory of William Shakespeare." That's about all that's left of that commemorative gesture, but it's there. Yet until my Australian colleague Philip Mead and I began to work on the 1916 Shakespeare tercentenary a few years ago, Gollancz's achievements and the impact of the tercentenary on the shape of theatre in Britain today had been simply forgotten. Commemoration is a looking back, a remembering, but it also, as we increasingly see, involves a great deal of forgetting. Cultural organizations tend to look back selectively, as the current incumbents seek to avoid being tied to earlier visions of the institution's mission. It's not quite as bad as a presidential transition, but it's in that neck of the woods sometimes. Everybody wants to be a pioneer. Nobody wants to be a sustainer. In the case of Shakespeare, the memorial and the national have been closely bound up from the beginning. And Galance's insistence on the insistent belief in the supranational significance of Shakespeare doesn't fit with the overarching narrative of a national Shakespeare theatre to which the 1916 tercentenary became subsumed. The awkward negotiation between Shakespeare, the national poet, and what we now call global Shakespeare arguably began with Galance's contribution to the tercentenary. On the one hand, the Book of Homage, with its extraordinary global reach in time of war. On the other hand, the national theatre. But the tensions of Shakespearean commemoration and the ongoing struggle for ownership of Shakespeare, always a futile thing to try to do, led to a sustained distortion of Galance's role in the establishment of the primary players in the Shakespeare industry in Britain today, and it has cost Galance his place in public memory. So we remember Shakespeare still, but we've completely forgotten one of his main commemorators. This incongruity, that a man whose vision for Shakespeare was so consciously international should find his fortunes harnessed to a project for a national theatre, and despite what he achieved for that national theatre should then simply be forgotten, bothers me, it annoys me. Yet Galance knew that a national theatre means little without the contrasting concept of the international. Since the construction of a national repertory requires the promotion, obviously, of the internal playwriting and acting talent of the nation over any external influence, a process, of course, of remembering and forgetting. Remembering those who have written in your geography and in your language, forgetting those from other geographies and other languages, even if, or perhaps especially if, they have influenced your own creativity. This can be both productive and oppressive. Productive in that the urge for a national culture, especially in a post-colonial country, can be instrumental in breaking out of colonial modes of thought. Oppressive in that nationalism can enforce an artificial break with history that can have catastrophic cultural effects. Which brings me for the final section of this talk to another instance of South American engagement with Shakespeare, involving not this time a Chilean writer, but an Argentinian. Forgive me, they did lose the football at least the other day. This is the 1984 novel by a writer called, and I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Vladi Košančić. Does that sound right? Anyway, Vladi Košančić, bliff. Called The Last Days of William Shakespeare, Últimos Días de William Shakespeare. Despite its title, it is not biographical. It is not about the last days of William Shakespeare, which is why I ordered it and then discovered it was different. It's set in the late 20th century, not the early 17th. And it does not represent Shakespeare the man. On the contrary, it shifts focus to Shakespeare the national cultural icon. And it enforces a reversal of perspective from the domestic to the political. That is, to the relationship between Shakespeare and the idea of national culture. And then, inexorably, to the relationship between Shakespeare and tyranny. The Last Days of William Shakespeare is an absurdist satire, written in the context of the Argentinian history of the 1970s and 80s, and it chooses surreal narrative rather than direct representation to comment on the violence and the cultural oppression that characterized the period. As Ariel Dorfman, writing in the New York Times, noted, the satire is not direct, is not allegory. While it's apparent that Košančić is satirizing the regimes that made so many Argentinians disappear, it is not clear precisely which, that of Isabel Perón, Košančić's mad visionary Fortunato Candini may represent José López Rega, the sorcerer, or of the military junta that overthrew her, led by the dictator Jorge Rafael Videla. Though this regime, which called itself the National Reorganization Process, clearly informs the novel's campaign for cultural reconstruction. As Dorfman describes it, the story, which is told in a dual narrative by a naive employee of the National Theatre called Renata and a pompous writer called Santiago Bondi, begins in a light enough vein, I'm quoting Dorfman here, in a South American capital that bears a startling resemblance to Buenos Aires. The National Theatre, housed in a decrepit building, has been quietly performing Shakespeare's Hamlet 856,904 times. A government faction denounces this as an insult to, quote, our traditional way of life, unquote. And taking control of the company mounts a campaign for cultural reconstruction which initially nobody takes seriously. What could be more ridiculous, after all, than a picnic at which the guests are instructed to chant "Down with Shakespeare"? Gradually, however, the mood turns more somber as the campaign slowly invades all walks of life, and the followers of the new director of the theatre begin to terrorize and murder the populace. We realize that under the guise of a search for, quote, the very deepest roots of our national psyche, a tyranny is being installed. Renata begins to hear of and then witnesses disappearances. A very old car passes by me like a dream. In it are some men in black uniforms, and between them sits a man wearing a white shirt who turns a very white face to the blind, deaf and dumb spectators on the pavement and shouts, "Long live Shakespeare!" He's silenced with a blow. Shakespeare thus stands in the novel quite a complicated way, both for cultural conservatism, the urge to keep looking to Europe for values and heritage, and for resistance to tyranny. Eventually, the army intervenes to stop the coup, but as the novel ends, it is too late for Renata, whose bewildered narrative voice is our only trustworthy guide. And it becomes depressingly clear that the nation's saviors are the same people who initiated the coup. The coup had begun quietly by way of a report in the foreign press that the country's national theatre appeared not to exist. Bondi, the pompous novelist narrator, reads the article aloud to his wife. The President Herrera National Theatre occupies a block in the centre of the capital city, yet a series of interviews with top-ranking officials and with notable figures in the artistic and intellectual worlds confirms that they do not even know of its existence. Bondi stopped reading. Unbelievable, he said. What theatre do they mean, Taco? His wife asked, raising her eyes from her embroidery. The journalist, however, tracks down the theatre and reports as follows. A, the National Theatre not only exists, but is subsidised by the Ministry of Education, the Municipal Council, and the Association of Libraries and Affiliated Institutions. B, it employs 435 people, including 8 permanent actors and 10 understudies. C, since 1920, they have staged only one play, Hamlet by William Shakespeare. This report provides opportunity for the rebellion, giving the plotters the provocation to reassert national pride and begin their pseudo-mystical campaign for cultural reconstruction, which first impinges on the theatre by way of an absurdist bureaucratic edict that the actors change their usual costumes. After prolonged research into the climate at the Danish court during the period in which the events described by the playwright William Shakespeare take place, the edict states, and in conformity with our belief that contemporary theatre should at all costs be built on a solid sense of realism, the Special Advisory Board orders as follows. 1. A change in the costumes hitherto used. 2. The replacement of all silks, velvets and other materials by fur cloaks, which will be duly delivered to the head of wardrobe at the theatre. This imposition of an arbitrary form of realism, it would be a wee bit toasty to wear fur cloaks doing Hamlet in Buenos Aires, presumably, has the effect of foregrounding the non-native identity of the play and of alienating both cast and audience. Koshančić's understanding of the last days of William Shakespeare is not biographical then, but cultural and political. Shakespeare represents, for the coup plotters, a marker of the decadence of a post-colonial nation that persists in looking back to Europe for its cultural heritage instead of creating its own. Thus, the National Theatre's one-play repertoire, the endlessly recycled Hamlet, exemplifies the nation's continued dependence on the old world, which, for the conspirators, must be abruptly terminated. We must, notes the leader in a conscious reference to Ayn Rand, return to the fountainhead. The past as local, that is, not imperial. Quite what the fountainhead is remains unclear throughout. Culture is the vehicle, not the tenor of the coup. When he's asked what will replace Hamlet in the National Theatre's repertory, Captain Bay, the military leader, says simply, it doesn't matter what play they put on. The novel thus both displaces Shakespeare and yet places him at the heart of a national struggle that it depicts in its absurdest way, a post-colonial struggle that manifests itself as local and tribal. The novel's title, The Last Days of William Shakespeare, is multiply ironic, endorsing the view of Shakespeare neither as a point of cultural stability in a chaotic political sphere, nor as the expression of an outdated New World dependence on the past that requires sweeping away if the nation is to stand on its own 2 feet. What seems clear either way is that whether in a healthy or an unhealthy global culture, Shakespeare's days are numbered. I asked as I began what it means to remember Shakespeare. From the texts we've looked at, it seems that a great deal happens when people remember Shakespeare. Very little of it actually to do with Shakespeare. It's a generative mode, this remembering. It creates visions of the future even as it looks back to the past. It involves a great deal of forgetting, and its ethical status seems infinitely shiftable. Is there such a thing as an ethics of remembering Shakespeare? If so, it will involve substantial dispute. What theatre practitioners, academics, journalists, the general public do when they remember Shakespeare differs a great deal. More often than not, their perspectives are incompatible. I've mentioned a Chilean and an Argentinian instance of the practical process of remembering Shakespeare, and they offer perspectives that differ in relation to the moments and the national context in which they were written. Shakespeare in each instance is a vehicle for other considerations, political considerations, considerations of nationhood. Shakespeare is endlessly associated with discourses of authenticity. How authentically to produce Shakespeare's plays? How authentically to build a Shakespearean theatre? How authentically to engage with the questions of nationhood that his work seems repeatedly to provoke? He has become a touchstone for cultural authenticity, at times a vehicle, at times a scapegoat. Our remembering of Shakespeare is a complex thing, and how we respond to the challenge of remembering him appropriately, generatively, imaginatively, seems always to underline the values that we do or do not share. That's it. Thank you for your patience.